What's up, English 7 students? Welcome to another video lesson. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the concept of plot. You should recognize plot as one of the main elements of fiction, along with character, theme, setting, and conflict. But plot is arguably the most important element, since plot has to do with pulling together all of the other elements. As you watch this video, you're going to need to have a few things in front of you. First, you'll need a place to take notes. For example, a chart like this one will suffice. You'll also need a place to draw out a plot diagram, something like this sheet here. Avid students, you might want to make sure that you're taking Cornell notes, which will look a little different, but will serve the same purpose. Whatever you use, make sure that you're getting everything written down. There's a lot of information here. Feel free to pause or back up the video as often as you like, as long as you get everything written down. There will be a quiz on all of these terms once you're done. And with that, we're ready to get started talking about plot. So the title of these notes is Plot Structure and the Plot Diagram. When we're finished, these notes will go in the class notes section of your binder. You'll be able to use these notes for all the assignments we'll have related to plot, and there are a lot of them. So be sure to take good notes and refer to them as often as possible. Let's begin by establishing the objective and essential question for this lesson. Today's objective, the goal for this video, is that we want to be able to recognize the different stages of plot. The essential questions are as follows. First, what are the different stages of plot? And second, how do you complete a plot diagram? By the time we're done, we should have an answer for both of these questions. Now, before we go any further, let's come up with a definition for plot. Plot is defined as the sequence of events in a story. It's all about the order the events come in, what comes first, what comes second, what comes third, and so forth. This definition should be the first thing that you write in your notes, and there's actually a spot for the definition on both the stages of plot chart and the sample plot diagram. So why don't we make sure that we have the definition written on both? Go ahead and write down the definition of what plot is on both sheets. Again, that definition is the sequence of events in a story. Once we have that written down, then we're ready to take a closer look at each different stage of plot. The interesting thing about plot is that every story that has ever been written has a plot, and just about every plot unfolds in exactly the same way in every one of those stories. We can use a diagram like this one to show the sequence of events in a story. Every story begins, progresses, reaches a peak, declines, and ends in much the same way. Each part of this diagram represents a different stage of plot. So, let's take a look at our little plot guy. He's going to be climbing Plot Mountain. He's going to begin at the bottom, preparing for his epic journey. Once he's at the foot of the mountain, he takes his first step and begins to climb. On the way up, his trip is fraught with danger, and it gets tougher and more exciting until he finally reaches the top. This is the most exciting part of his journey. After that, it's all downhill as he descends and returns to the earth below and resumes his life as normal. Each one of these stops represent a different stage of plot. So as we define the different stages, make sure you write them down on both the plot notes and the sample plot diagram. Our first stage of plot is called exposition. So let's begin by labeling your plot diagram in this area. This should go in line number 1, right on the beginning of the plot diagram. Once we have that written down, then we're ready to talk about just what exposition means. In your notes, you're going to be writing in the box with the runners at the starting line. We do this because the exposition is at the very beginning of the story. The exposition introduces characters, describes the setting, and gives background information necessary to understand the story. Without an exposition, we would be lost when we got to the other parts of the story. It's not really exciting, but the exposition introduces the story by telling us everything we need to know to follow the story. Once we have that, we're ready to move on to our second stage of plot. Our next stage of plot is called initiating event. Unlike the exposition, which might consist of several events, the initiating event consists of only one event, which is why it's represented by a dot on our plot diagram. So that's going to go on line number 2 on your plot diagram. The initiating event is going to go in the box with the soccer ball and the tennis shoe because it kicks off an important part of the story. The initiating event is the event that introduces the main conflict, which, as we know, is the main problem in the story. The initiating event tells us what problem the protagonist will be facing, which adds to the excitement we experience as we read. The exposition that comes before doesn't have any real exciting parts, and the excitement doesn't begin until we encounter that main conflict that the protagonist is going to be facing. Once we've gotten our initiating event, we're now ready to move on to the next stage of plot. Our third stage of plot is called the rising action. And the rising action refers to everything on this big long line. So when we indicate the rising action, unlike the initiating event, which was a single event, the rising action is going to be several events, which is why this line is so long. So on your sample plot diagram, make sure that you're writing rising action for item number 3. Now we're ready to define it on your notes sheet. The rising action is signified by a ladder because it is going up in the story. As you read the story, it signifies all the excitement that tends to build during the rising action of the story. The rising action is a series of events that build the tension of the conflict. Once we encounter that problem in the story after the initiating event, the problem tends to get worse, which builds more tension and more excitement. The story increases in intensity, meaning that the more you read it, the more interesting, exciting, and complicated it becomes. This lasts, the rising action does, lasts from the initiating event all the way to the next stage of plot, which is called the climax. So it's going to be a lot of events. In fact, the rising action is going to be the longest part of the story. Most of your story is going to be rising action. Now we're ready to move on to the climax of the story. Our next stage of plot is the climax. The climax comes at the top of our mountain and is a single event. The reason why the climax is at the top of the mountain is because it is the moment of greatest intensity and excitement that comes in a story. So everything else is building up to this moment. So for number 4 on your sample plot diagram, you'll want to write down the word climax. Now let's define it. The climax is signified by an erupting volcano because it's a moment when something truly significant is about to happen. The climax is the point that comes right before we find out the outcome of the main conflict, meaning that it comes right before the main character begins to solve his or her problem. This is usually the moment that has the highest tension and the greatest intensity. In other words, this is the part of the story that is the most exciting, the part of the story that we're really waiting for, the good part in that movie or book that you're reading or watching. This part of the story is sometimes called the turning point because this is the part of the story where everything in the story changes. Throughout the rising action, everything seems to be going in the same direction, usually a direction that's bad for the protagonist. When we get to the turning point, everything changes, and suddenly that problem that the protagonist has been facing starts to get solved. That's why we call it the turning point. Once everything changes, we move in a different direction, which we refer to as the falling action of a story. On our plot diagram, the falling action comes in this line here. Unlike the climax, which is a single event, the falling action can be several events, although there won't be too many events in the falling action because you're nearing the end of the story. The falling action lands here on our plot diagram, so it's this line between the climax and the line at the bottom. So the falling action should be written as number 5 on your sample plot diagram. With the falling action, we use something like a guy with a parachute because our action in our story is falling just like he is. The falling action is all of the events that happen after the climax. This is a part of the story where the conflict, the story's main problem, begins to be resolved. Our story has already reached its most exciting point, so everything afterwards is going to be less exciting. The story will decrease in intensity and you'll start to get close to the end without a whole lot of excitement because the story is winding down. After our falling action, we've got one more part of plot to talk about. Our last stage of plot is called the resolution, and we can find that here on our plot diagram, number 6. It's the last thing that happens in the story, and it's all about looking at the conflict in the story and seeing how that conflict is resolved. So on your plot diagram, it's going to be number 6. Our resolution is signified by a little present because our resolution gives us that good feeling inside the same way that you get when you open a present. With a resolution, the story is going to come to a reasonable ending. All the loose ends are wrapped up and all the questions that you might have had will probably be answered at this point. The most important thing with the resolution is that the main conflict of the story is resolved in some way. In fact, if you look at the word resolved, part of that word is solved. So think of it as the conflict being the problem. The resolution shows how that problem is eventually solved at the end of the story. All right, so let's put it all together. Let's talk about where each one of these things happens in the story. The exposition is going to come at the very beginning of the story. The initiating event is going to come near the beginning of the story, and it kicks off all the action in the story. The rising action is going to be the middle of the story, and it's actually also going to be most of the story. In most stories, like you say the Harry Potter books that might be 700 or 800 pages, the rising action is going to probably be 700 out of those 800 pages, and everything else will be fitting into that last 100 pages or so. So the rising action is going to be the middle of the story, and it's going to be most of the story. The climax will come near the end of the story, but it's not the complete end of the story because the end of the story is the falling action and resolutions. So all of these kind of tell us where we'll find these different stages and how much of the story it comprises. The rising action is going to be the vast majority of the story. The falling action may be a few events, and most everything else is going to be something very small and very brief. So let's review. The different stages of plot are the exposition, the initiating event, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. Remember that every story that's worth mentioning follows the same pattern and consists of the same elements. And with that, we're done with our notes on the stages of plot. Remember that both these sheets, the plot notes and the sample plot diagram, should be placed in the class notes section of your binder for future reference. Now that you're done with the notes, you're ready to show what you know by taking a brief quiz on Google Classroom. Thank you for joining me today, English 7 students. It's been a pleasure narrating to you. This is Mr. Washington reminding you that reading is to the mind what exercise is to the body. Bye-bye now.